What if Minecraft was more realistic and challenging? What if tornadoes ripped through the landscape? What if you had to fight starvation while maintaining a balanced diet? If you missed out on any specific nutrients, you would gain a poison effect and die. What if you needed to stay hydrated and stay hot or cool as different seasons emerge through your time playing? What if you had to do all of this while working your way through the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s and build yourself an empire to rival that of Great Britain's? To accomplish this, I plan on creating an oil network to produce unlimited amounts of power. Once accomplished, I plan on creating excavators and mining drills to dominate the ore frontier. As history states, he who rules industry rules the world. Day 1. I knew if I wanted to survive in this pack early on, I needed to go foraging, as if I tried to attack animals, they would attack me back. So I immediately went and looked for plants to smash so I could grab the fruits from them. You can't make wooden tools inside of this pack, so the first thing I did is I went and I grabbed some flint, smashed it on some rocks to create some flint shards. I then went and created myself a flint knife. With a flint knife, you can grab some string from the grass. This enables you to make more advanced tools in the early game. I then thought it was a bright idea to take my newly formed flint axe and attack this cow until it decided to attack me back. Didn't know when they added that feature to Minecraft. While searching for my first cave, I found this random merino ewe that was dancing around in the rain. I'm not exactly sure why it was doing that, but it was quite cute. I ended off the day by going spelunking looking for some basic ores. I knew if I wanted to take over the world with an industrial revolution, I needed to start early with gathering supplies. When I emerged from my cave spelunking, I found this Dutch doe. It was very cute, so I thought I'd add it into the clips. I then performed some micro crafting so I could get my hands on a stone pickaxe so I could mine some iron I had found. While searching for another cave, I found this giant ravine in the middle of the terrain, and I decided to go and investigate it and to pull out all the ores that I could. While mining in the ravine, I found some copper ore. This is going to be essential to make some machines later in the game. I also found some bauxite ore. When smelted, this becomes aluminum, which is another essential crafting component to some of the higher tier machines later in the game. I then mercilessly eliminated this zombie. To end off the day, I began hunting for some string so I could make a bed. The sunset was beautiful, and all the animals actually laid down at nighttime. This is a super cool feature. Day 3, I began the day by smelting all the iron I had found inside of the caves. I then watched as my first emission block drifted into the atmosphere. This wasn't going to create any problems, right? I had forgotten that Tough as Nails was inside of this mod pack, and I immediately began overheating, so I jumped in this pond to save my life. This was going to be tough. I knew since there were seasons inside of this mod pack, I needed to get a farm going, and I needed to get it quickly, as we were in summer right now, meaning there was only one season between us and winter. I then crafted a sleeping bag, and I slept my first night. Day 4 and 5. I started out the day by crafting a saw. This enables you to get wood a lot easier. You can't actually craft logs into planks, unfortunately. I found a cave near my new house with untold riches, so I decided to dive in and take up all the resources I could find inside of it. There was a mine shaft inside of the cave as well, which was amazing because it had epic loot and made it a lot easier to actually mine things. It's not efficient to go strip mining inside of this mod pack because you need ores of all Y levels, and strip mining is just not very effective for that. So you want to find big caves so you can get all the ores you need to start making machinery as early as you can. Day 6. To start out the day, I took all the ores that I had mined from my mining adventure, and I began smelting them down. Later that day, I had ventured out to find a horse, but I found this giant hole in the ground with all these assorted ores, and I couldn't stop but mine them all up. I didn't learn my lesson the first time, and I started picking a fight with all the bulls I could find to steal their meat. With the leather that the cows dropped, I could now make a saddle, which would enable me to actually ride the horse. Later that day, I found my first victim, friend, that I was going to tame, so he could become my transportation for the rest of the series. After I convinced him that our friendship would be legendary, he decided to make me his friend, and I was able to ride him. However, I don't think he ever went to one day of gym class, because he was the slowest creature I have ever mounted. So I decided to find a new horse, and I left him abandoned in the middle of the forest. I'm sure he'd be fine. Day 7. I began the day by expanding my farm. I wanted to grow more of these hemp seeds, as they'd be essential to the first form of power I'd be creating inside of this mod pack. I then began using a water bucket to clear some of the terrain around so I could expand the farm even more. Later that day, I began my search for clay. Not only was clay going to be essential in creation of a lot of the machines in this mod pack, but if I was going to be creating giant factories and houses, I wanted to make them out of brick, and clay was going to be very important for that. I then figured out how to open my nutrition bar to see how balanced my diet was, and just like real life, I was lacking pretty much everything, but I didn't really care. I then went adventuring with my new horse Boris, and we found this village and I began to loot everything inside of it. Day 8, I began the day by looking up how to make a coal coke oven. The coal coke oven is a multi-block structure made by coke oven bricks. It creates coal coke and a byproduct of creosote. To make it, it's simply a 3x3 cube with a hollow center. It's a pretty simple machine. All you do is place coal in it and eventually will make coal coke for you. Coal coke is a better version of coal essentially, and it's also needed for some other recipes down the line. I then slept to end off day 8. Day 9. To begin advancing inside of the world, I needed to create an engineer's workbench. But to do that, I needed some more materials. I went out and I grabbed a little bit more wood. I thought at this time that you needed spruce wood to make treated wood planks, which would then make your engineer's workbench. But turns out you can use any wood type. When I got home, I made my first bit of treated wood. I was going to need to make a lot of this inside of the world, but for now, we just needed a few pieces to make our engineer's work table. This would enable us to create blueprints so we could start seeing machines that we could start building inside of this world. Day 10. If I was going to create an industrial revolution that would rival that of Great Britain's, I thought it would be a good idea if I made a house, so that I could at least sleep inside of it instead of on a sleeping bag outside like a normal peasant. So I began with the initial construction. This would be an ongoing project throughout the series. As we advanced more machinery, the house would expand, and as we advanced to different power things, the house would obviously have to be incorporated into that. But I figured for now, I needed to have the base structure going so I didn't look like such a peasant. Day 11. I began the day by looking into the first bit of power generation that would give me an edge on this world. I decided that my first bit of power generation was going to be a windmill, so I created one, and I decided I was going to build it just out of basic oak fences. You can place it on top of anything as long as it has enough room to spin, so I just placed oak fences down because I liked the aesthetic, and it was cheap. After crafting the windmill, I realized I had no way to convert the power. The raw windmill would not power anything without a kinetic motor. A kinetic motor transfers the rotations of the windmill into usable power that I can then connect to wires and use it around my base. But to craft a kinetic motor, I needed redstone, and I hadn't got any of that. So I crafted a bunch of iron pickaxes, and I spent the rest of the day mining, looking for redstone, and picking up any other ores I found along the way. Day 12, I began the day by expanding my farm once again and creating more industrial hemp. When you have windmills, you can put windmill sails on them, which make them spin a lot faster. But to create the sails, you need a lot of hemp. So I decided to expand the farm early, so that when I needed to expand my windmill farm, I would have the windmill sails required. I then began my micro-crafting so I could create my first kinetic motor. It required an assortment of materials, some copper, some iron, it required some plates and some wires, but eventually we crafted it and we were ready to place our windmill. Once the windmill was set up with a kinetic motor, I realized I had to now transfer the power from the kinetic motor to a usable item. To do that, I needed connectors and I needed low voltage wires. I wasn't rich enough to make any medium voltage or high voltage wires, so some basic copper low voltage wires were all that I was going to be. To transfer the power, you have 3 options. You have low voltage, medium voltage, and high voltage. Now, I was pretty poor at the time, so I decided to use low voltage connectors. This would enable me to connect from the windmill anywhere I wanted within an 8-block radius. Day 13. With the addition of power, I knew I was going to be progressing quite quickly now, so I decided I wanted to finish at least a floor to the house so I could start placing things inside. As I built around it, everything would be okay inside. I was also building at this point because I needed to wait for more creosote to be made inside of my coal coke oven. The coke ovens take forever to create anything, so I figured some building right now would be a good idea. Midway through the day, I decided it'd be a good idea to create a mine shaft, so I created this cool little tunnel that goes underground, and ended up finding some diamonds at the very bottom. It was a very successful end to the day. Day 14. The next step towards automation and machine creation was going to be a blast furnace. But to create a blast furnace, I needed more clay, as I'd used it all to create bricks for my house. So I spent most of the day just collecting clay, as it takes a little while to mine underwater. Day 15. I returned home from my clay adventures. I threw it all inside of my smelter, and I waited for it to smelt. Meanwhile, I decided to expand my farm once again. I'm not kidding you when I say you need a lot of hemp to progress inside of the windmill aspect of this mod pack. Day 16. I expanded my farmland even more to create more hemp. To create enough power to power some of the machines that were coming up, I needed a lot of windmills and I needed a lot of windmill sails. And I was going to be prepared to absolutely destroy this industrial revolution and to rival that of any country that has ever been known to do it. Day 17 to 23. Ores were blocking me from expanding my machinery. I had my coke oven and I was ready to create my blast furnace, but I needed more tools and I needed more ores to actually create some of the other machines inside of the mod pack. So I spent these days mining. Rather than going mining every 2 days, I figured I would just do it in one segment. Here's a quick time lapse of that mining.
I just wanna feel free, and I just wanna be me. Yeah, I just wanna go so crazy. I just wanna be a freak. Yeah, I just wanna rise to the top. Yeah, I just wanna go reach the peak. So I've been really well focused on success. Hey, y'all will see. Yeah, you'll see that I will get it. Cause I'm really focused, man. I make it with the rap and I just follow my path. I just follow my passion. To me, this is what's precious. Yeah, in my soul, man, I can feel it. So every single verse, man, I just gotta go and kill it, man. I gotta be the kid. I could be the guy taking you wild. I could be the villain, but good as a kid. Lately I'm painting my path on my way. Yeah, I got no time that I can waste. So I've been sitting in the space. Yeah, making rest every day, man. You know that I go insane. Yeah, I hit you with a bullet to the brain. Let us stop first cause we going insane.
Day 24. I decided I wanted to dive into immersive engineering. But to do that, you need an engineer's manual. To make an engineer's manual, you need a book. So I went out and I slayed some animals to collect some leather to make a book. When you combine that with a lever, you get the manual. The manual has all of the machines and how to create them inside of it, so it's very essential to the mod pack. The one stupid thing that I found in all of this was how to craft a lever. This is the only mod pack that they've added in a custom recipe that I've ever seen to craft a lever. You know what? That was my quarrel. That was it. But to create a blast furnace, I knew I was going to need to head into the nether, as that was the next step inside of the mod pack. So I began preparing for that to close out the day. I then attempted to head into the nether, but then realized I was overwhelmed by heat, and I had no way of getting water. So after a minimal time inside, I decided to get out as quickly as possible. Day 25. To advance inside of the mod pack, you need a blast furnace. But to make a blast furnace, you need blaze rods. So, armed with some water bottles, a shield, and a sword, I headed back into the nether and began attacking Blaze. Thankfully for me, there was a fortress that spawned right by my portal, and it was a blaze spawner that was pretty easy to find. It was also located under a bunch of blocks, so the blaze couldn't fly away. So it was just a matter of time. They lit me on fire a few times. Eventually, I got the blaze rods that I needed, and I ran out of there as quickly as possible. Day 26. Post returning the nether, I knew I could now make a blast furnace, but I realized that to make a blast furnace, I needed nether bricks. So I headed back into the nether to collect some netherrack, so I could then smelt it into nether bricks so I could craft my first blast furnace. While I was waiting for everything to smelt, I decided to harvest my farm and collect the hemp that had been growing so far. I then constructed the blast furnace the same way I had constructed the coke oven. Right-clicked it with an engineer's hammer to make it into its multi-block counterpart, and nothing happened. After some googling and troubleshooting, I discovered that the center block was not supposed to be hollow. It was supposed to be a solid cube, so I replaced it, right-clicked it with my hammer, and there we go, a blast furnace. I then went on the hunt for some iron to place inside of my newly made blast furnace. This would then translate into steel once it had smelted. Steel was going to be essential into building my empire that would span the ages of Minecraft. Day 27. Although extremely eco-friendly, a windmill is just not a great source of power. But a water wheel is a little bit better. So I began the creation of a water wheel in front of my house. I was going to need more power if I wanted to power some of these ginormous machines this mod pack has, and a water wheel next to my house was going to be perfect. I had the idea for the first machine I wanted to create, but I needed more power to do it. So I spent the rest of the day crafting a water wheel and making it look semi-aesthetic pleasing. Day 28. Once my water wheel was up and running, it was time to start transferring power. Now I didn't have the machine ready yet that I needed the power to go to, but the machine was going to require more power than the water wheel could make. So I had the idea to place some batteries, also known as capacitors, next to the water wheel. This way, while I was waiting to make the machine I wanted, it would fill up these batteries, and when I could make the machine, I'd have a bunch of batteries to power it. This machine was the next progression step inside of the mod pack that would unlock even more machines, but I needed more power to do that. So I placed some LV, which are low voltage capacitors, next to the water wheel. These would fill up over time. They hold 100,000 RF each. Day 29. I began the day by tinkering around with the transformer. I wasn't really sure what it did, but it looked really cool, so I was trying to figure out if I could hook up more wires to it, and trying to figure out how I could fill up these capacitors even faster. I was trying not to smelt my ores down, as this next machine would be much more efficient for that, but I needed some more iron to create this next machine, so I decided I need to throw out my smelter now, so that I'd have it for later. I was ever faced with the looming fact that I needed nutrition if I didn't want to die inside of this mod pack. However, killing animals wasn't exactly a viable solution, because to get animals to mate inside of this mod pack, you need to make them happy, they need to be fed water, it's a big hassle. But there was a workaround. You can place ground traps on the ground, and eventually, if you put bait in them, they will attract those animals and it will give you the subsequent drops, such as different meats and different leather types. This would at least solve my protein problem, and then I could focus on the other ones later. Day 30. This was a big day inside of the mod pack, as it was the day I was going to finally prepare for building the next machine. I started out by expanding my house a little bit. The smelting had given me the ability to craft some more blocks and to build a little bit more up on my house. I then made some electrum. Electrum is essential in the creation of the next machine. To make electrum, it's just gold grit and silver grit. You can get that by putting a hammer next to the subsequent ores, and it'll then give you the grits. The electrum grit will then smelt down into ingots and would allow me to craft the next machine inside of this mod pack. Day 31, perhaps the biggest day inside of this world so far. I began the day by finishing out the microcrafting required to build the next machine. This machine was called the Crusher. What the Crusher does is it duplicates the ores that you put inside of it. This is why I was waiting for so long to actually smelt down my ores, because I wanted them duplicated before I actually had to smelt them. I didn't want to waste any materials, and I didn't want to have to go mining for any longer than I needed to. The Crusher is a multi-block structure, so I had to reference the wiki on how to build it. I built it wrong like 3 times because the wiki is stupid, and it doesn't know what it's talking about. If I was smart, I would have used the engineer's manual, but the wiki seemed like it was more useful until it never, ever worked. At this point, I was watching tutorials and I was trying to figure out how the Crusher would work as my centerpiece for this industrial revolution. Because as they say, he who rules industry rules the world. It took me the entire day in watching multiple tutorials and referencing multiple wiki pages since the original one was broken, but I eventually created the Crusher to end off the day. Day 32. I was really stoked to use my new Crusher, but first I needed a way to auto-input and auto-export the items, so I made some conveyor belts. I then hooked it up next to the export and next to the import buses inside of the actual Crusher itself, so that I could then begin crushing ores. Every machine inside of immersive engineering requires a lever to be powered on, so I quickly crafted one before I started the machine. After spending some time trying to figure out where the lever went, I then tried to figure out why the machine wasn't turning on. I didn't know at this point that you actually needed to throw the ores in before the actual machine turns, so I began Googling why my machine was broken. Through pure happenstance, I just decided to throw an ore inside, and I saw the Crusher move and crush the ore down. This was going to be the start of my industrial empire. Also, this machine looks very, very cool. Day 33. I began the day by collecting all the ores I had from previous mining expeditions and throwing it inside of the Crusher so it would begin to crush it into dust so I could smelt it later. I then began to figure out how to make a juicer so then I could take vegetables and juice them, which is a better way of collecting the food than eating the vegetables raw. To make the next machine I wanted, I was going to need some nether quartz, which meant going back into the overheating nether. There's a metal barrel you can make and you can fill it with water. When you do that and you right-click it with a water bottle, you then get water out of it and you can use it inside of the nether. This is a great way for storing water because you can't bring water buckets, for obvious reasons, into the nether. I then went exploring the nether and found some nether quartz. I also picked up some magma shards just in case I needed them later down the line. I didn't know exactly what they could be used for, but I figured they might be useful. When I got home, I grabbed all of my grits out of the Crusher and I threw them inside of a furnace. The fish net works similar in the way to the animal trap. You simply just put fish bait in it and over time it will collect fish. I needed a jellyfish from this because jellyfish can be transferred into a slime ball, and a slime ball was going to be crucial in the next item I wanted to craft. Day 34. I noticed some of the water turning to ice. This meant that winter was coming, and this was not going to be fun. I began facing a problem that my coke oven was filling up with creosote, and it was stopping to work. So I tried making a jerry can, as jerry cans hold more than a bucket, but it didn't really work, and I was just stuck with an overhauled coke oven anyway. I spent the next part of the day doing a bunch of microcrafting for refined storage. Refined storage is a way better way of storing items than chests. When you're playing with mod packs, it's really hard to keep track of where everything is going, as there's so many new blocks added to the game. This would help me in the long run a lot. I then discovered that the water I was using to actually turn my water wheel was turning to ice. But I used an old vanilla trick where if you put torches next to ice, they will now then turn into water and never back into ice. It's a great trick for if you're in a cold biome. I finished off the day by creating my first block of refined storage, the crafting grid. Day 35. I finished crafting the basic computer by crafting the drive bay and the controller. Although primitive, since we could only use floppy disks at this point in time, it was good enough to store some items in small quantities. I then spent the rest of the day breaking down my chests and transferring all of the items into my new storage system. Day 36. I began the day by creating some spools of copper wire. This would allow me to relay the electricity from my water mill into my house so I could start focusing on machines that were localized inside of the actual house. I then created some stairs out of stone and a little platform to place the capacitor on top of. Eventually, I would make this an entire floor dedicated to industry, but for now, it was just going to fit my new capacitor. Day 37. I began the day by crafting some furnaces. I then went upstairs and I expanded the floor a little bit, and I began creating an automated furnace system that would work from my new power generation from the water mill. Because there's an air block in the middle of the coke oven, it creates some emissions, and eventually those emissions stop the coke oven from working. So I destroyed it and I replaced it next to my blast furnace. I then checked my blast furnace to see the progress it had made, and I removed all the slag from it so that there wouldn't be any buildup. To end off the day, I hopped into the nether to grab some bone blocks so I could bone meal some carrots, as I was running scarily low on food. Day 38 to 43. I had hoped my first mining expedition would have been enough to tide me along till longer, but I was progressing too fast. I needed to make more machines, and I needed to make more high-tier machines. I needed a lot of high-voltage wire and a lot of high-voltage appliances, but to do that I needed aluminum or bauxite, and I was running very low on it. So I went out mining and collected all the supplies I could. Day 44. When I had returned from mining, I had found that the surface made me very cold, so I made a full set of wool armor. It didn't do a lot, but it helped a little bit with keeping me warm. I was running low on wood, so I decided to go chop down some trees. Later that day, I tinkered around with how I was going to connect my crusher to my new power system. I wanted everything to be in a central place. Eventually, I was going to create a power station, but for now, it was going to be inside of my house. That didn't seem like a problem considering that high voltage wire was running by wood, right? Once I got my crusher working, I saw this thick boy near my house, and I decided I would chop it down to see how much wood it gave me. It gave me 25 logs, which was truly impressive. I then tried eating some of the berries it dropped. I've never experienced worse food in my life. I then watched from my rooftop my crusher work. I can't get by the animation on this thing, it's just so cool. Day 45. I spent most of the day gathering more clay from the regions around my area for upcoming machines. Day 46 and 47. I took all of the grit that my crusher had outputted from all the ores that I'd got from mining, and I began smelting them down so I could advance the next machines. To place the next machines, I really needed to make a power station, so I began terraforming the ground around me and evening it out so I could start building some more structures and some more machines around my house. Because immersive engineering is such a reflection of how real-life power works, I wanted to create a power station as sort of a central grid for where all of my power would be inputted and outputted to. I wanted to reflect everything I did in immersive engineering, just like how real life orchestrates power. Day 48. I began the day by inspecting my coke oven and making sure it was still running effectively, and taking some creosote oil out of it so I can make some more treated wood. I then went and crafted a bunch of treated wood for some items I would need a little bit later for my power distribution. I went and harvested all of the hemp from my hemp farm. It regrows even in wintertime. Not all the crops do, unfortunately, but thankfully hemp does. Now that I had the base of my power station going, I needed power to actually input into my power station. This was going to be in the early game by windmills, so I made 3 more and a bunch of windmill sails from the hemp I'd been collecting so far. Day 49. I needed a cactus to progress inside of the mod pack, so I crafted a nature's compass. Nature's compass allows you to see what biomes are close by and allows you to track a certain biome. So I went to the closest desert to actually start collecting some cactus. While collecting it, I noticed a village nearby and I went and looted it. Nothing too crazy, but any food at this point is essential because in the wintertime, food doesn't grow. Day 50. For some reason my OBS missed parts of this. I'm not sure if that was a user error or a client error, but we'll just chalk it up to chance and client error. Anyway, I decided I would start off the day by making some wire connectors and some relays. This would allow me to now connect the power. A wire connector allows you to transmit power and allows you to input and export power, but relays allow you to actually relay that power in whatever capacity you want, from 0 to infinity RF presumably, across distances. The relay would allow me to build a network around my base, and the connectors would allow me to take power from the relays into different machines. Day 51. I began the day by tearing down my water mill. Now that I had these windmills producing power into my power station, I didn't need the water mill anymore. I then hung a capacitor right in the center of my house, and I switched on power from there all the way into my power station so that my house could be powered from there. This was the concept, because at this point I didn't know you could make insulated wires, and I kept running into the wires and electrocuting myself. I figured if I could have the power at the roof of every single floor. I could string the wires near the ceilings to attach to all the machines, and therefore I would never zap myself. This was a great theory, until I found out insulated wire was a thing. Day 52. I began the day by transferring all... Not transferring. Transforming? What's the word? What's the word when you change something? Like when you upgrade it, update it? I literally just said those two words. There's a better word. No, when you switch something over, you convert. I think convert is the word I want. I think convert. Day 52. I began converting all of my medium and low voltages to high voltage wires. Although I couldn't actually produce enough power to utilize these wires, I knew in the long run this would be handy so I wouldn't have to come back later and switch them all out for high voltage. Because I knew in the long run I wanted high voltage wires running on my central system and then medium voltage wires running into each application. This way I could utilize the most power running from my relays and it wouldn't be too expensive to make all these high voltage capacitors. Day 53. I began the day with some good old hemp farming. I then tore down the original windmill that got me started in this world. I wanted to build one more windmill, as 3 would be the maximum efficiency I would need for the limited amount of machines I was using at the moment. So I created some sails. You put these sails on top of the windmills, and they act a little bit faster and they transmit a little bit more power. I then began the construction of my next windmill, and I hooked it up to my central power station. Day 54. I began the day by expanding my center floor. I then began to try and clean up some of the wires inside of the house. I was tired of getting electrocuted at every single time I walked by one. I knew we'd be making another big machine soon, so I knew I needed to fill up some capacitors. So I began tinkering around with how I could create a system to start filling up capacitors while still maintaining my network power. Day 55. I started out the day by collecting all the meat from my ground trap. It was super important because during winter time, nothing grows, so I had to collect any remnants of food I could find. I then went to my furnaces, and I collected all the ingots that had been smelting. I left them in there for quite a while, and most of them had finished up. I realized how slow everything was, so I tried a new idea. I noticed that there was a blast furnace inside of the mod pack, so I created one, and I placed it in place of a normal furnace. But when looking at the UI, I couldn't figure out what the heck it did, and I just didn't know. So I took it down, and I replaced it back into my original furnace, which was still slow as heck. I then made some iron into some iron blocks and replaced them inside of my blast furnace to continue converting into steel. Near the end of the day, I noticed a storm approaching. I realized that my power station might be too far away from my original weather deflector to deflect, so I quickly created another one, and I ran over there and placed it down, and just in time, because as soon as I placed it, I selected that the interface would deflect any thunderstorms and or tornadoes that came by the area, and as soon as I did that, the storm died, meaning that storm was probably about to rip apart my power station. Days 56 to 59. I needed some more terracotta. This was important in the building recipes of a lot of different items in the high voltage center. It was also important because it was what I was going to build my pathways and roadways with inside of this civilization. So I hopped back on Boris, I grabbed my nature's compass, and I began hunting for a terracotta biome. I kept having to build bridges for Boris on my way because every time he went into the water, apparently he does not know how to swim and he just sinks like a rock. Experienced a little bit of spring. Even though it was still winter, because I was in a desert biome, it acted like it was summer, which was great. I spent the rest of the day mining out the terracotta, different colors for different things that I had in mind. I wanted to use the red for my roof, the brown for pathways, and then original terracotta for some crafting recipes, and to convert it into other colors if I so desired, down the line. I then arrived home on the tail end of the day 59. Day 60. I began the day by enchanting some shovels. This would give me a little bit of efficiency. You see, today was going to be the day I was going to start road work. I wanted to start building roads everywhere so I could start putting power poles everywhere so I could start relaying power all throughout my base without electrocuting myself by accident. I spent the rest of the day mining out some blocks with my newfound shovels and placing some brown terracotta. It was going to act as my concrete roadway for now. Day 61. I was having some issues with the vanilla mobs that were spawning around my base. They kept attacking me and blowing up blocks. So I created these lamps inside of immersive engineering. They require power to work, but not only do they look super cool and provide light, but they prevent mobs from spawning within a 32 block radius. I began placing light poles everywhere and the lamps on top of them, and then linking them together with copper wiring. Thankfully, they don't need any sort of transformer or any sort of capacitors on them. They simply link to each other and they transmit power as such. I then collected what had been smelting inside of my furnaces as I was going to be using some bricks and some ores very soon. I went over to my blast furnace and I swapped out the iron and I put some more iron in it and took out the steel that I'd be required for the next builds. I worked late this day and did a bunch of micro crafting until I was eventually able to make a core sample drill. This drill enables you to sample the dirt beneath you. When you stand inside of a chunk, it'll tell you what this chunk has inside of it. Either it'll tell you a specific ore, a specific fluid, or a specific vein. If you get a vein, it can be a whole clump of ores. If you get a fluid, it can be something like lava, water, or oil. Oil is something that we'll be looking for next to progress inside of this mod pack so that we become an industrial empire. Day 62 to 65. This was only supposed to take me 10 minutes, but it ended up taking me 3 full Minecraft days. I used my drill sampler in a lot of chunks around my base, and I kept coming up with nothing. There was either no minerals, or no liquid, or just neither of each. It was just a terrific time. I kept finding useless veins. I found a uranium vein, except there's no way really to make nuclear reactors inside of this mod, so there's really no point in getting uranium. What I really wanted is I wanted an iron vein. Now, this might sound rudimentary, but this entire mod is based around steel. And to make steel, you need a bunch of iron and a bunch of coal. So the optimal vein to find would be a vein for coal and for iron. But I would take iron at this point, as coal is pretty easy to get, especially if you put Fortune 3 onto it. I spent these entire days just running around different chunks. I tried to stay close to my base because I didn't want to be transferring items all the way from there to my current base. Finally, on day 65, after a lot of searching, I found a vein with iron and gold and oil in it, and I was ecstatic because this meant I could get both of the things right from one chunk, which would be amazing. Day 66 to 69. The entire reason we used the core sampler was to find somewhere we could place an excavator. An excavator is a machine that excavates ores from the ground. It's basically like a quarry, but it doesn't actually remove any blocks. It just uses the core sampler to detect what types of blocks it'll excavate. So I spent these days building it. Day 70. I began the day by making reinforced blast bricks. This would enable me to make the next tier of furnace, which would enable me to make steel a little bit faster. I needed a lot of steel for some of the upcoming machines. I needed some lava, so I hopped back into the nether to grab it. The excavator I had just built, I didn't have enough power to power it. I just wanted to build it because it looked really cool. But I had an idea to how to primitively power it, but for that, I needed lava. I then crafted a thermo-something generator. I forget what they're called. But when placed down, if you place a hot and cold source opposite sides of it, it will then create power. I was going to use this to primitively power my excavator, and just to see if it would work. Once hooked up, I noticed that it moved slightly. This was not terribly efficient, but it would get me a small trickle of ores while I worked on other things, and working on ways to actually power it permanently. Days 71 to 74. This was going to be my last mining expedition. In all, it lasted 3 full Minecraft days. To prep for it, I enchanted some iron and some diamond pickaxes with basic efficiency. This would allow me to mine ores a little bit quicker, making my maximum effort less. The next step inside of this mod pack was to create enough energy to power machines like the excavator. With those types of machines powered, I could finally automate ore production and power production. However, I needed more bauxite. Bauxite was realistically the thing that was holding me back. To create anything high voltage, you need a lot of aluminum. Aluminum seems to be the highest tier of resource when it comes to creating these wires. But aluminum only spawns at high Y levels, and caves generally dive down really deep, really fast. So it took me a while to find some initial points of caves where I could find some bauxite, so I could actually get crafting more of these high voltage equipment. Day 75 to 77. I started out day 75 by crafting enough resources to remake my crusher. Since I'd used a lot of the resources to make my excavator, I needed to remake a few of the blocks so I could actually make a crusher again from all the ores I had just mined. I then began to rebuild my crusher. I could almost build it from memory at this point, the amount of times I had torn it down and built it back up again, which was great because the wiki is always wrong when it comes to building these items, so it's good to actually memorize how to do it. I then grabbed all of my ores and I threw them inside of the crusher so that it would crush them down into grit. Each ore duplicates into 2 grit, which can then be smelted into ingots. While waiting for it to happen, I decided it would be a good idea if I built my house a little bit more. So I added some more blocks to it out of the blocks that I had while I was waiting for my crusher to work. Day 78. Between day 77 and day 78, we'll call it 77.5, I crafted a roof for the house. I also placed some vents so that the pollution would not kill us inside. To craft some of the next machinery and buildings that I wanted, I needed a lot of materials and I needed it fast. These 2 furnaces just weren't going to cut it, so I manually placed down some furnaces like a peasant, put some coal in them and threw my grit in them, and began smelting down all the resources I would need for my next builds. I did a bit of research and I discovered that uranium works as a cool and a hot agent for these thermo generators, so I placed down some blocks to see how much power they would increase. It increased a little bit. While I was waiting for everything to smelt, I decided to start building my factory, so I crafted some factory blocks and I used a chisel to make them into unique factory blocks. Even though I didn't have enough resources to make walls or a ceiling for my factory, I knew placing the base would be essential because this way I could place the machines on top of it and I could build around it as I accumulated resources. Day 79 to 81, it was time to start creating some big machinery. So I did a bunch of micro crafting to get some of the blocks I would need to start crafting my first machine. After finishing my micro crafting, I had all the resources I needed to make what's called a pump jack. A pump jack extracts oil from the ground, which you can then use later to refine into gasoline or diesel. After following the wiki's instructions and successfully building it wrong, I YouTubed another video on how to make it and successfully made it. I then crafted a lot of wooden posts. I wanted to start stringing relays all around my base so I could start transferring power to what would soon be my oil refinery. Day 82. I started out the day by ravaging my carrots. I forgot to replant them, which would come to haunt me later. I then accomplished all the microcrafting it would take to make a distillation tower. This takes crude oil and refines it into biodiesel and into gas. I used my sample drill to mark out a chunk, as I wanted to make sure it would all be built inside of the same chunk in case I needed to chunk load it later. The theory behind what I was doing was simple. I wanted to use a diesel generator to power my entire base. But to do this, I needed diesel. My distillation tower would not only create diesel, but it would also create a byproduct of gasoline and also a byproduct of lubricant. Lubricant is used with all the machines to actually give them a 25% boost in speed. When using a diesel generator, the diesel you get from your distillation tower only actually uses about 75% of the power required to make itself, meaning you have a 25% remainder that the diesel generator has in excess. So every time I create 1 bucket of diesel, I actually create 50,000 RF that is not used in the creation process of said diesel, meaning I can use it to power my entire power grid for 50,000 RF. Considering that an excavator only requires 4,000 RF per tick and it's one of the more beefier machines, this would be plenty. Day 83. Once my pump was actually working, I would need a way to get the crude oil to my distillation tower. I built these apart on purpose because later down the line it's going to be much more convenient to have my distillation tower over there than it would be to have it next to my pump jack. It's a very simple fix to get the crude oil over there. All you need to do is place pipes that connect from your pump jack to your distillation tower. I placed these pipes underground so it would look a little bit cleaner. Day 84 to 85. I spent these days troubleshooting my distillation tower and trying to get it to work. The first problem I ran into was no crude oil was being imported. I was using capacitors to power my pump jack and to power the distillation tower just to see how they worked. I then realized that for the crude oil to be pumped out of the tank, you needed to put a lever on it. This was a simple fix, and it started importing my crude oil into my distillation tower. Because the distillation tower would create two byproducts, being gasoline and lubricant, I needed something to store them, so I created 2 more tanks to actually store these byproducts. The distillation tower does a lot of things, but what it doesn't do is actually separate the 3 products it creates. Nothing inside of the machine separates the outputs, meaning that all 3 outputs come out of one pipe. I don't exactly understand how this is logical, considering that all of this is based off of real-world applications, but we'll go with it. To actually extract what fluids I wanted to extract, I had to put a fluid extractor on the exterior. This lets me extract certain fluids different directions depending on what I want to go. However, I kept running into a problem. Diesel just would not export for some reason. I didn't know why, but it wouldn't go into the tank that was nearby. I don't know if diesel can't go into tanks or what the problem was, but I kept fighting with it and I kept trying to figure out how to flow diesel out. Day 86. After a few hours of research with my game paused, I finally figured out the issues I was having with the diesel pipes. I then began creating a diesel generator. The generator would work based off of the diesel I was importing from the distillation tower, and would then power the actual distillation tower itself. Currently I had capacitors going that were powering everything, but those were powered by windmills and it just wasn't enough power to sustain what I was doing. As an attempt to not break the recurring theme, I built it according to the wiki once again. And once again I built it wrong. I then researched a YouTube video and built it according to that video, and of course, it worked out just fine after that. I don't know who made this wiki, but I don't think they were from this century because nothing in it is at all updated to the current mod. To close out the day, I dug a hole in the ground and I began to pipe my diesel over to my new diesel generator. Day 87. I began the day by crafting some more of those poles. I was going to need to transfer power all around the world from my new diesel generator. However, then I was inspired. Rather than having 2 lines next to each other, one importing, one exporting, I decided it would be a better idea to run the importing lines underground, and this worked perfectly. Simply, what I did was I took the power from the actual diesel generator, attached it to a relay, and put the relays underground. Relays work for, I think, 32 blocks, so it was really easy to connect all the wires under the ground. Another good reason for this is that I'm using high voltage wires so they can carry 32,000 RF. You want to use high voltage wires because a diesel generator creates a ton of RF. However, high voltage wires cannot be insulated, meaning if you touch them you will most likely die, so having them underground is also a safer option, because although these poles keep everything overhead, if you jump you can hit them, and I've had a few experiences where they've zapped me and thrown me back many blocks. Day 88. I ran out of relays from all this underground wiring I was doing, so I crafted some more relays because I was going to need to transport power in a giant circle. After placing the relays on top of the posts, I placed the connectors on top of the machines. This would allow my relays to connect to the connectors and power my machines. The first 2 machines I was going to power were my pump jack and my distillation tower, since they were crucial to actually powering my diesel generator. Once I had a good line going, I could then start connecting it to things like my excavator. Day 89. I finished the line and I connected the last one to my distillation tower. I now had to start thinking of ways to troubleshoot. Because I could only carry a certain amount of RF along these lines, I needed to figure out a way that I could get more power onto these relays. Day 90. After doing more troubleshooting, I hooked up my diesel generator to my power lines to see if it would finally work. It was time to test my entire theory. I'd built this entire power network without really knowing if it was going to work or not, so it was time to see if my theory would come to fruition. After I connected the final wire to my diesel generator, I went and checked all of my machines, and everything was running. It was a blissful moment. Day 91. I was running into the problem that even though I was producing enough power, I was not transporting enough power. Each one of these connectors can only transport 4,000 RF per tick, so I needed a way to get more of that power onto the relays. I came up with another simple theory that I could also apply to my machines. Have the maximum amount of connectors attached to the machines, but have it all connected to one relay. Have this relay transmit power everywhere, meaning one relay can transmit to 4 connectors, in which case all 4, which meaning 12,000 RF per tick, can be inputted into. After my dream had been realized, and production of ores and everything else could be automated, I started to run into an issue that I'd long forgot about: pollution. For some reason, my coke oven that had been running the entire game had produced less pollution in the time span that it took my diesel generator to create within the first 3 minutes of it working. To solve this pollution crisis, I was going to need to clean up the air a little bit, but to do that, I needed another star. Oh boy. I attempted to go into the nether with steel armor and no looting on my sword in an attempt to kill wither skeletons to get skulls. This proved to be very ineffective. Day 95 to 96, I spent slaying mobs in the night. This was to accumulate experience so I could enchant a sword to get looting 3. Then I filled up my metal barrel with water. I used my fish trap to get some more jellyfish, and I crafted some slime armor. This would keep me cool inside of the nether. I then spent the next while killing many skeletons, and I think 3 out of the 5 skeletons that I killed at the very end dropped skulls. I don't understand how these odds work. On the eve of day 100, I spawned the Wither, and I prepared for the battle of the series. Day 100. With the ever more polluted world, the first thing I wanted to do was to destroy my farmland. The reason I wanted to do this was so that my plants would regrow and suck up all the carbon from the atmosphere. Even though I had now a permanent way of stopping emissions from going into the atmosphere, I needed a way to clean up the current ones, so I began mowing the lawn. The Industrial Age. For most, this was a time of hardship. Long hours at their local factories as the world evolved around them. But for some, it was a time of vision. You see, industry is what runs the world. As Henry Ford once said, we are entering an era when we shall create resources which shall be so constantly renewed that the only loss will be not to use them. There will be a plenteous supply of heat, light, power, that it will be a sin not to use all that we want. This era is coming now. As we emerged into the coming age, our only enemy was pollution, and once overcome, we would have the green light to create a massive industry that would shake the universe to its core.